Joe McNamara has spent years learning one simple rule about the intelligence world. The most dangerous person in the room is usually the one you are never watching. And Season 3 may have just given us the biggest clue yet that Joe isn't being hunted because she made a mistake in Ukraine. She may have been hunted because someone wanted her to make that exact mistake. The timing is too clean. Joe's team receives information about Alexei Yurimov from a Ukrainian operative working inside Russian intelligence. They cross into Donetsk, capture the target, remove his locator, and return home believing they've pulled off a major intelligence victory. Then, almost immediately, Russian-linked operatives appear at Joe's house. They know who she is. They know enough to come looking for her. And eventually, Joe is taken alive. That doesn't look like random retaliation. It looks like the second phase of an operation that began long before Joe ever stepped onto that battlefield. And this is where the title, The Spider and the Fly, starts feeling less like a cool espionage phrase and more like a warning. Joe thinks she's hunting the spider. She thinks she's the person pulling the strings, sending teams into hostile territory and identifying threats before they reach American soil. But what if Joe is actually the fly? What if the entire Ukraine mission were the web? Because look at what happened. A mysterious Ukrainian agent suddenly provides the CIA with intelligence on one of the most valuable Russian targets imaginable. Joe's team acts on it. They enter one of the most dangerous battlefields in the world. They expose their methods, their personnel, and their interest in Yurimov. And then Joe comes home, only for foreign operatives to show up at her front door. The question isn't simply, how did they find Joe? The more disturbing question is who wanted them to find her. That puts Oleksandra Balakin directly under the microscope. She's the Ukrainian operative who supplied the intelligence that started this entire chain reaction. On the surface, she looks like exactly what the CIA needs. An insider with access to Russian intelligence who can provide information the Americans could never obtain themselves. But intelligence operations don't work on trust, they work on verification. And Joe understands that better than almost anyone. That's why her reaction in the debrief is so important. Joe points out that the Russians had plenty of opportunities to identify her in the field, yet they never did. Then she receives this enormous gift of intelligence from a Ukrainian source, captures Yurimov, returns to America, and suddenly Belarusian operatives are attacking her house. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. And Joe is experienced enough to recognize it. But here's where I think the theory gets much more interesting. Oleksandra might not actually be the mole. She might be the person we're supposed to suspect. And that's a very different thing. If someone wanted to compromise the Lioness operation, what better move could they make than to provide information through a Ukrainian agent who already looks suspicious enough to become the obvious explanation? Once Joe starts asking questions, everyone naturally points toward Oleksandra. She provided the intelligence. She had access to the Russians. She led them toward Yurimov. Then the attack happened. Case closed. Except Joe doesn't seem convinced. And if Joe isn't convinced, neither should we be. Because the real mole would understand exactly how intelligence officers think. They wouldn't leave behind evidence that screams, "I did it." They would leave behind a trail that points towards someone else. Now consider what the attackers actually did to Joe. They didn't simply walk into her house and execute her. They wanted her tracker. They were looking for something hidden on her body, and when they found it, they took Joe alive. Later, the same kind of operation succeeds. Joe was abducted from her car, and again, the priority is locating her beacon. That's a massive clue because it tells us the objective isn't necessarily revenge. If the Russians simply wanted Joe dead, they already had opportunities. Instead, they're interested in tracking her, isolating her, and extracting information. That means Joe herself is valuable. Someone wants to know where she goes, who she communicates with, what she knows, and potentially who else is connected to her. And that changes the meaning of Yurimov's capture completely. What if Yurimov was never the prize? What if he was the bait? The CIA believed it was hunting a Russian intelligence officer, but what if the operation was designed to expose the people who would come after him? Joe's team captures Yurimov, and suddenly the Russians have an opportunity to watch exactly how the CIA responds. They can learn which operators are involved. They can observe how the extraction works. They can identify Joe. They can determine how quickly Washington reacts. They can even measure how much the CIA knows about Russian intelligence. In that scenario, Joe's team didn't simply capture an enemy operative. They revealed themselves. And there's another detail that makes this even darker. Joe believes the man they captured may not even have been Yurimov. Her suspicion that they could have been handed a substitute changes everything. Because if the target was an imposter, then somebody successfully convinced the CIA that they had captured one of Russia's most important figures. Imagine what that means. The CIA celebrates a victory that never happened while the real Yurimov remains exactly where he needs to be. Meanwhile, the people behind the deception get to watch the Americans expose themselves without losing their actual asset. Joe's words about capturing some actor instead of the real Yurimov suddenly become more than an insult. They could be the key to the entire conspiracy. And this is where the real mole becomes terrifying, because if the operation was engineered, someone needed to understand exactly what would happen after the CIA received the intelligence. They needed to know Joe would take the mission. They needed to know the target would be important enough for the CIA to act quickly. They needed to know that Joe's team would return to American soil. And most importantly, they needed to know enough about Joe to find her. That suggests an enemy with access to information far beyond what a random Russian operative would have. Someone understands the CIA operation from the inside. That doesn't necessarily mean the mole is a high-ranking traitor sitting in a CIA office. It could be someone connected to the chain of information surrounding Ukraine. Someone who knows which intelligence gets elevated, which agents are trusted, and which operators will be sent into the field. That's why the Russian response feels so strange. The attackers at Joe's home are described as Belarus nationals and contract hires. They aren't elite Russian officers arriving with official markings. They're disposable assets. And that may be the point. Whoever is behind this doesn't want their fingerprints anywhere near Joe's doorstep. They want layers between themselves and the operation. Contractors attack Joe. Russian intelligence denies involvement. The Ukrainian agent becomes suspicious. And somewhere in the middle, the real architect remains invisible. There is also a reason Joe's family matters to this theory. For years, Joe has managed to keep her professional life separated from her home life, even though that separation has constantly been collapsing. Season 3 finally destroys that boundary completely. Her husband sees the violence, her daughters are moved into protective custody. Joe can no longer pretend that the people hunting her exist only in some distant foreign battlefield. The enemy has reached her front door. And whoever planned this understands that attacking Joe's family doesn't just hurt her emotionally, it changes how she operates. A compromised Joe is easier to manipulate than a detached Joe. If you can make her afraid for her children, you can force her to make decisions she wouldn't normally make. That's why the kidnapping may be the most important development of all. Joe is taken alive because the people behind this still need something from her. They aren't finished. They may want the names of the people involved in Yurimov's capture. They may want to know what the CIA learned from the operation. They may want access to another intelligence source. Or they may be trying to discover exactly how much Joe knows about the Ukrainian agent. And if Joe realizes that Alexandra may have been used as part of a much larger operation, the interrogation could become a race against time. Because Joe doesn't just have to survive captivity. She has to figure out who betrayed her before the people around her start disappearing one by one. And there's one possibility that makes the entire situation even more disturbing. What if Alexandra is actually trying to expose the real mole? What if she gave Joe the Yurimov information because she had no other way to reach the CIA? Maybe the information was deliberately designed to trigger a chain reaction that would expose someone higher up the ladder. If that's true, then Alexandra's behavior suddenly looks different. She isn't necessarily betraying the CIA. She could be playing a much deeper game, one where she knows that telling the truth directly would get her killed. So she gives Joe something irresistible instead. A target. A mission. A trail. And waits to see who reacts. That would explain why the season keeps pushing Joe toward Alexandra, while simultaneously making the situation feel too obvious. In a spy thriller, the obvious traitor is rarely the most interesting answer. The real betrayal usually comes from the person who had a reason to be trusted. Someone who has been close enough to the operation to understand its weaknesses. Someone who knows Joe's habits. Someone who knows where she will be and when she will be vulnerable. The person who betrayed Joe may not be the person who gave her the intelligence. It may be the person who knew what Joe would do with it. And that's why I think Season 3 is setting up a much bigger conspiracy than a simple Russian retaliation. Joe's attack wasn't just punishment for Yurimov. It may have been the consequence of a controlled intelligence operation designed to expose the Lioness network. The Ukraine mission gave the enemy the opening. Yurimov gave them the excuse. Joe gave them the target. And now her kidnapping gives them the opportunity to finally get the information they've been chasing. The terrifying part is that Joe may already understand this. She immediately questions the timing. She questions Yurimov. She questions Alexandra. She questions how the Russians could have identified her so quickly. That's exactly what makes Joe so dangerous to whoever is behind this. She's not simply trying to escape. She's reconstructing the operation. And if she puts the pieces together, the person who thought they had turned Joe into the fly may discover that they accidentally put the most dangerous investigator in the intelligence world inside their own web. Because eventually Joe is going to ask the one question nobody wants her to ask. Who knew where she was before the Russians did? And when she gets that answer, the real mole may be the last person she expects.